Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Getting to Net Zero, Opportunities for SME Business Sector Leadership. My name is Ala Dragola, and I'm the Director of Parliamentary Affairs and SME Policy at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's webinar. From a personal perspective, I'm very, very excited about today's discussion. Climate change is something that is talked a lot about, but is typically associated with either larger emitters or certain sectors, and is rarely discussed from an SME perspective. But with the increased focus from governments on getting to net zero and more consumers than ever before wanting to shop or do business with businesses that are, green conscious and environmentally focused, it is really important for us at the Canadian Chamber to be helping small businesses learn how they can participate in emission reduction and what opportunities exist for them in this space. We are excited to deliver today's webinar in partnership with Climate Smart, who works to help businesses profitably reduce their carbon footprints and build capacity towards net zero and other ESG goals. The Canadian Chamber first began working with Climate Smart back in 2016, and we're excited to continue building on that partnership over the next few months, beginning with today's webinar. Joining us for the discussion is Climate Smart Training Facilitator, Maureen Cureton, who will be presenting for us today before we turn over to you, the audience, for some questions. Maureen has facilitated Climate Smart business training for over 10 years, guiding businesses learning to measure and manage their carbon footprint. She also designs and teaches university and college courses and is presented on a variety of topics related to business climate leadership at events with attendees ranging from 50 to 500. She's co-authored 3 books on environmental sustainability and is most interested in teaching and learning about the intersection between business and environmental sustainability. Maureen holds an MBA and an undergraduate degree in natural resource and environmental management. We also have Christine Vanderwill joining us here from Climate Smart to help facilitate the discussion and help answer any of your questions. As always, we will be taking questions at the end of this presentation through Slido. The Slido event code for this webinar is 938255. So please head over to sli.do to submit your questions during this presentation using that code. And once again, it is 938255. This will be a more interactive session, so I encourage you all to get your Slido open right now. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Maureen to take us through the presentation.
Thank you, Ala. Great to be here with you all today, and to be here with my colleague, Christine, the amazing Christine Vanderwill. We are going to talk about getting to net zero today. And as Ala said, governments are all over this. We're seeing commitments around the world, but not just governments. We're seeing, particularly in the large business sector, companies like Microsoft and Google and companies around the world, big companies saying, we're going to get there. So what does it mean to get there? And what does it mean for SMEs? Are we part of this discussion? But before we get there, I want to actually make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to greenhouse gas management. So measure and management is key to getting to net zero. So here's our agenda: climate smart business, what and who we are and who the businesses are that are part of this, the SME role of climate action, the small to medium-sized enterprise sector, why businesses measure and manage their carbon footprint and how they do it, and then what is net zero and why and how we want to get there. And then it is interactive. Get into the Slido. If you missed that number, it's on your meeting invite for the code to Slido. But we're going to spend a bit of time with Q&A at the end. But you can, as you know, enter questions and vote on questions as we go through. So before we move forward, I want to introduce Radical and Climate Smart. As Alan mentioned, I've been training with Climate Smart part-time for about 10 years, and they started up a few years before that because they recognized that businesses are starting to talk about the importance of measuring and reducing your carbon footprint. But it was large companies who had the capacity to hire staff with that expertise or had the budgets to hire consulting firms. But the SME sector didn't have that kind of capacity and didn't have those kind of budgets. So Climate Smart came to be as a social enterprise that said, we want to fill that gap for SMEs to help train and support them to step up and take responsibility for climate action. And then after about 10 years of doing this consulting and training, Climate Smart became part of the Radical family last year. Radical Balance has been in the business of carbon offsets and also working on consulting around climate action, particularly supporting larger businesses in the energy and the agricultural sector. So it's been a really interesting marriage and really adding particularly to our understanding and our chops around carbon offsets. So what about the Climate Smart family? Well, more than 1,200 businesses have been part of this Climate Smart training program. And it is a wide variety of businesses, from consulting businesses to small manufacturers to warehouse and transportation businesses, lots of professional organizations from law firms to architecture firms, insurance companies, some credit unions, and even some not-for-profits in there. We had a small university in my Manitoba training group, and we had some municipal governments, which was a first for me through Climate Smart to work with them. And I have to say, we often talk about what are your reduction opportunities, and sometimes there's similarities, sometimes there's differences. But I recall when we talk about transportation opportunities, we usually say, do you have a sales fleet? Do you have trucks? Do you have delivery vans? Those are the conversations. I never expected to hear that we have Zambonis. And one municipality in Manitoba said, and we've converted them to run on electricity instead of fuel. I'm like, brilliant. That's a first for me. And that's part of the fun for me in doing Climate Smart training, is I get to learn from all these businesses and I get to share their stories. And I'll share a few of them today. But results, so far on average, our Climate Smart businesses have reduced their carbon footprint or greenhouse gas emissions. That means the same thing if you're a newbie to this. About 24% we're seeing the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and our top performers are exceeding 30% reduction. So this is fantastic, but this is not net zero yet, right? So how do we get there? But it's also important to recognize that these businesses aren't contracting. Most of them are growing on an average 2.7% per year. Some of them are growing way faster than that. And at the same time, we're seeing co-benefits, we call it, such as reducing their operating costs or increasing business efficiencies or other benefits of being part of this commitment to climate action. So why SMEs? Why are we targeting SMEs? I mean, isn't the damage to the environment being done by big businesses? Well, in case you're not aware, SMEs represent 97.9% of all the Canadian businesses. That's 9 in 10 people in Canada in the private sector work for SMEs. And a lot of our spending is done with SMEs. So, okay, great. So lots of small businesses, but still, climate impact, who's doing it? Well, SMEs are accountable for 30% of our climate emissions in Canada. That is actually more than the oil and gas sector in aggregate, SMEs together. It's more than all the cars and trucks and trains and domestic flights on the road. So this is a chunk of greenhouse gas emissions. So Climate Smart loves data analysis. We love collecting data and doing and using that to guide decision making and recommendations. And we did some analysis and recognized that collectively SMEs in Canada represent an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 200 million tons. So that could really contribute to climate action. I mean, to helping address what some cities and parts of the world are calling this climate emergency. And I can tell you, I'm here in Vancouver, having just lived through the heat wave where people are dying. We are aware there is a climate emergency. So I love speaking about this, though, not just as the risk, but as the opportunity. And this is actually a fantastic quote from the International Chamber of Commerce. They talked about the fact that it is an opportunity. More companies than ever before are placing climate action at the heart of their business strategy, integrating into their business strategy, into their investments, and into how they operate their businesses. They're embracing it as an opportunity to drive innovation, increase competitiveness, enhance risk management, and stimulate growth. That is such a great way of looking at this, not just as a responsibility or a moral thing we need to do, but as a business opportunity. So why don't we turn to you now and get your brain wrapped around this? What do you think, if you run a business or an organization, or if you're thinking about running one, what do you think would be 2 key drivers or motivations, or also we call them co-benefits of reducing your carbon footprint. So just, I think my colleague Christy from the Chamber is going to put up the poll on Slido. Just pick 2 there, and we're curious to see what you all have to say and compare it to what we hear from our climate smart businesses.
Perfect. So let me share the results with you. So with 61%, operating efficiencies reducing costs is number 1. Next is gain competitive advantage, differentiate your company at 40. Oh, we just had one come in, 47%. And demonstrating leadership is at 32%.
That is so interesting. It's interesting to me because that's actually very aligned with what we've seen with climate smart businesses. I have to say, in my years of climate smart training, cutting costs and boosting efficiencies were the overwhelming driver. But what I've noticed actually in the last year, when we asked this question in every training group, I've heard leadership become more and more prevalent. Not that they don't care about saving money or driving efficiencies, but I remember one pretty senior business leader that was participating in the training saying to the group, it's table stakes. Like, we cannot show up in business if we do not step up and take a leadership position on climate action. So climate leadership and industry leadership is becoming more and more important. We're absolutely, marketing, reputation, brand images, who cares about that? Is it your customers? Is it your partners? Is it your supply chain? Is it the broader community? All important. I put also attract and retain employees. We see businesses either think that's an opportunity to have great employees, particularly millennials. We're seeing, the numbers tell us that millennials will actually say, I want to go work for a company who cares about the environment. But also on the flip side, I see when businesses get into climate smart training, they recognize that engaging their employees can be a way to have a cultural transformation, to make them feel proud about working for this organization. So they might not have come to climate smart training for that, but by the time they finish it, they build that into their action plan. This last one on the slide, anticipating future requirements. We didn't used to hear much about that, but we did a survey, particularly in Manitoba last year, and this came out as one of the top 3 for them. And it's not surprising because they were dealing with the carbon tax rolling out in Canada. What is this going to mean for Manitoba businesses? So, what else? What other regulatory or customer expectations are out there? So I think that's that whole idea about de-risking your business from government expectations or new costs or customer expectations of you. And also when we talk about de-risking, particularly in certain sectors, I was listening to the head of Unilever Canada talk the other day, and he said for us, climate action is directly related to our business case because we rely on agriculture to, we need food to be grown so we can make all our products. And if the climate is creating droughts or floods or changing our growing seasons, our business is going to suffer, right? So recognizing that whole idea that climate action collectively is going to help de-risk your business as well, right? So it doesn't matter. When I work with businesses, I don't care what their motivators are. It's just I want to know them because it might affect the plans that you make. If saving costs are what you care about, you might do different things than engaging employees as your driver, right? So I'm going to share a few examples. This is Western Stevedoring. They're a pretty large SME. They're on the M side of the SME. They operate out of the Port of Metro Vancouver, which has been a fantastic leader in encouraging businesses at the port to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And for them, they said, saving money. Everything that we do when it comes to greenhouse gas management, we have to have a business case that's going to increase efficiencies. So, and sure enough, they're saving more than $250,000 a year, and at the same time reducing their greenhouse gas footprint so far by 15%. And how did they do that? Mostly they looked at their equipment, they retired some of the really old stuff, they retrofitted some of their heavy equipment, the engines. They increased their maintenance program, just recognizing that, if equipment isn't well maintained, it's not running efficiently, right? And they did do some replacement around forklifts and other equipment to move to lower no carbon solutions like electric forklifts or more high efficient vehicles. This is John Brooks out of Mississauga, and I think they also have operations in Alberta. fantastic. They were in my training group when we rolled out with the chamber. I love these people. Their general manager was in the room and one of their senior leaders, and they recognized that this was an opportunity, obviously saving money. Again, they care about that, but they really wanted to demonstrate leadership, and they wanted to engage their employees and really build this into cultural transformation. And you get the feeling that people love working at John Brooks. And so what they did is they incorporated some, capital investments like changing their light bulbs, but they also did a whole bunch of behavioral change strategies, getting their employees on board. So, the lighting retrofit in their warehouse and their operations, it's saving them $21,000 a year, less than a 2-year return on that investment. But they also said to their employees, like, turn off the equipment when you don't need it. That's a no-cost solution, but it's part of the conversation that we're in this together, and we can all be part of the solution for climate action. And some of the purchasing decisions, switching to 100% recycled paper. These are not complicated solutions, but collectively these all contribute to a 23% reduction in their CO2 or the greenhouse gas emissions in the first year alone, which is pretty impressive. And what I really love about them is they launched this green team, and they use the green team to push that cultural transformation. They also get the green team to test different ideas and to measure and to see what's working and to ask questions. They're really right now working on waste reduction and looking at what kind of waste they generate within their operations and what the employees' role in that and how do they engage employees to make sure employees generate less waste. And it's been really fun to hear their results about their different experimentation. I always love sharing this story. Weber Naturals, you might have seen their products on the store shelves. They have a pretty significant operation. They run a farm where they actually grow a bunch of their ingredients. They manufacture, package, and sell these vitamins and nutraceuticals. And for them, the key driver was operational savings, operational efficiencies. But what I love about them is they said, hey, you know what? We're diverting all sorts of ways. We're paying to have stuff hauled away. We're paying recyclers to take stuff away, but it's costing a lot of money. So let's think a little differently. What actual byproduct of things that we make might be actually an ingredient that someone else finds useful? So these gel caps that you can see in the picture, they actually come in sheets and they punch them out to make the different gel caps. And then they have all these waste sheets that, it's actually an organic material that, was going to be recycled or composted. But they actually realized that it's actually the chemistry of it, it's a useful ingredient for the adhesive industry. So they actually found an adhesive company in their neighborhood to buy it off them. So they went from paying to have it hauled away, 150 tons of waste, to selling it for $50,000 a year as an ingredient to another company. Some of their other byproduct or organic materials, they grind it up now, and it's used for animal feed nearby. And that's reduced their operating costs by 30% and reduced CO2 emissions by 165 tons a year. And then they invested in a baler because, lots of their bottles and their materials come in this soft plastics. Anybody who's in manufacturing knows this is the bane of our existence. Everything's wrapped in these soft plastics. But in fact, if you properly bale it, it can become a commodity. So they went from paying to have it hauled away for $65,000 a year to selling it for $15,000. So they're net 80K up, and they're diverting 79 tons of baled soft plastics a year. So I just love the way they just said, let's not think about this as a responsibility or cost. Let's think about this as an opportunity to actually solve a problem for us and for another company by other organizations by sending their organics to other businesses. And the 505 Junk, they're a pretty small company that went through our training. They did some great stuff around their GHG reductions with how their vehicles and putting in scales to create some operating efficiencies, really helped them actually increase their revenues, increase time efficiency, reduce fuel consumption. But I always tell this story because they love sharing the fact that they landed the largest contract they'd ever landed because they measure and manage their carbon footprint. So they were going for this opportunity with a large property management company to haul away the materials for the company. And the companies asked in their RFP, what is your climate commitment? So what are your environmental commitments? And by being able to tell them that they measure and reduce their carbon footprint through Climate Smart, they ended up winning the contract. And a similar company told us the same story. They just want to contract with municipal government because of their commitment to diverting waste and climate action. So, is your RFP opportunities with government or other businesses, you're going to see this more and more, the questions being asked. Walmart, as a large company, has their Project Gigaton, where 2/3 of their suppliers now are required to measure and be reducing their carbon footprint, and they want to go to 100%. So this is something we're seeing more and more in the business sector. If you want to do business with us, we're measuring our carbon footprint and managing it, and we expect you to as well. And I love this company out of Manitoba. I mean, they're just talking about really the moral obligation. They're saying, if it matters to our children and our grandchildren, why shouldn't it matter for us? This is why we're taking action on the climate. So it's a beautiful sentiment, but quite frankly, Telpay is, they're in the business of electronic payment processing. And so strategically, they have more than 100,000 business clients across Canada that they're helping to eliminate paper paychecks and envelopes and all the associated paper. And so by going to the efficiency of working with Telpay, they're helping those businesses reduce their carbon footprint. And of course, Telpay is making money along the way. And they calculate their carbon footprint, and they also calculate that the paper saved by their clients would be the equivalent of a mature 80,000 tree forest so far. And what I love about them is they're doing this because of their commitment, but they actually want to share their story and inspire and support other businesses. So they're documenting their own green plan. They publicly report their carbon footprint, and they're saying, hey, anybody want to learn from us? We're happy to share with you, particularly their client base. So different drivers, different businesses, it just kind of affects how you plan your reductions. There's no right and wrong in terms of what your drivers are. Again, back to the International Chamber of Commerce, we have as you all know, I'm sure that we had a Paris Agreement a few years ago where governments came together and said we need to take climate action. We set some targets. There's an upcoming meeting again where they're going to get really much more specific around how we're going to get there and what are our expectations. And we anticipate some agreements around the expectations with businesses. And the ICC is actually stepping up and saying, we want you to require all businesses to measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions. This is really interesting. Again, we're seeing more and more large companies around the world. It's table stakes. You've got to be measuring and reporting. We have this carbon disclosure project where you can go online and see most large businesses, what they're reporting. But the idea that all businesses, with the chamber representing, 145 million members around the world, saying we think all businesses should measure and report the greenhouse gas emissions. This is really interesting. They also want to see governments have frameworks around, how will we support and stimulate this shift to net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the future? And how are we going to finance that? So what is the government, the private sector's role in helping with that transition to net zero in business? And that's, the finance sector, you may be aware, this originally came out of Europe. We're seeing now it's come to Canada, where there's different banks, and Vancity, as Canada's largest credit union, has said, we are not only going to, we've been measuring our carbon footprint for a while, we are now going to measure the impact of all our mortgages, loans, and investments and move to net zero for them. So huge opportunities and activity in the banking sector. And the same thing as I just mentioned about RFPs, that means banks are going to start asking their business clients, so are you measuring your carbon footprint? Are you reducing your carbon footprint? Maybe they'll have different financial products to help you reduce your carbon footprint, to make those capital investments in vehicles or building retrofits. But at the end of the day, if we're going to be measuring all this, we have to figure out a way to measure it. So I just want to make sure we understand that there is a very specific standard and protocol. We don't just make up these numbers, right? And so here's, management guru Peter Drucker many years ago that said, what gets measured gets managed. And that's the whole idea around greenhouse gas emissions too, that we, in order to guide businesses to measure and reduce their carbon footprint, we need to get a sense of where their emissions are coming from. Sometimes, we can kind of guess based on the sector that you're in, but we need to get specific and we need to get serious about measuring. So there is a carbon accounting protocol. And for any of you that are accountants out there or work with accountants, you know that GAAP is an accounting protocol for financial accounting. Similarly, we have an accounting protocol for greenhouse gas management. And it's called the Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard. It was developed by the World Resources Institute together with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they brought together businesses to guide this development of this protocol. This is the protocol that we train to at Climate Smart. Our 1,200 plus businesses use this protocol for their measurement and management. And multinational, small, medium, large organizations, cities around the world are using this protocol. So it's a very common and consistent. I mean, the important part about this is just like accounting protocol, and then we know that everyone's on the same page about what's required to measure and manage, right? So in a nutshell, what does this mean? Well, first of all, you're going to identify what are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions for your particular business. Then you're going to use that to guide, make decisions about putting together an inventory. So there's a little bit of art and science, just like in financial accounting, in terms of what we measure. But there's also best practices about what to include in your inventory. And then you collect that data, and report it every year. And you use that to guide planning and action, right? And if you want to get to net zero, you will then offset your greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll get back to that in a few minutes. So some businesses will do their reporting internally, monthly or quarterly. I was at HSBC and I did quarterly reports to our executive. But at the end of the year, we also then summarized and publicly reported our greenhouse gas emissions. And that's pretty common with businesses. So back to you. What do you think are your, without having measured, I'm assuming some or many of you haven't measured the carbon footprint of your business, but what do you think, given your type of business or organization and the sector you're in, what do you think are the 1 to 2 biggest areas of impact for your business? So Christy's going to launch that poll again, and we're going to see what you all think is your impact.
All right. So Maureen, we're looking at building energy, gas or electricity is 59%. And then we've got a tie at 19% with waste and paper consumption.
Interesting. Again, I love to play this game when I'm doing training. What kind of business are you? And I kind of guess what I think the biggest sources of emissions will be. But it's a good, that's a good, I think, people picking building energy, whether it's gas or electricity, because overwhelmingly in Canada, a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. But, I remember having a business that was a transportation related business. They were in the moving business, and they were in my training, and they were doing all this work around their using laptops and saving electricity in the office. I'm like, who cares? Like, your footprint is overwhelmingly about your vehicles. So it very much depends on the type of business you are. And also a consideration, gas, absolutely. If your building is heated with natural gas or oil in some parts of Canada, like on Vancouver Island, that is a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. Electricity, it depends where you are. If you're in Alberta, if you're in Ontario, absolutely, because the source of electricity is coal or oil or gas for a good portion, certainly in Alberta. When we're seeing the heat wave move to Alberta now, and they're talking about the air conditioning load going through the roof, that's going to be a whole lot of coal and gas running that air conditioning right now. But here in British Columbia and our friends in Newfoundland, where I had fantastic training experience, Quebec, Manitoba, they're largely hydroelectricity. So while you might use a lot of electricity, the greenhouse gas emissions aren't that as significant. And that's why we see in some parts of the world a push to have more buildings actually heated by electricity rather than gas. So that's something to consider. And those are the kind of things that, when you work with Climate Smart, we help figure out those emissions factors for you so you don't have to go to do that kind of analysis. But waste, I love calling waste a significant opportunity, even if it's not the biggest part of your footprint. It's an opportunity to engage your employees, because it's something employees tend to pay attention to. They can see it. If you change the lighting in a building or change your, heating and ventilation system, they don't really notice, right? But waste is something you can get them on board with. You can do behavioral change campaigns. You can have competitions. You can, remove the waste bins and just have recycling bins. We see a lot of waste reduction in office-based businesses, and of course in food production and manufacturing businesses. This can save all sorts of money. Paper consumption is such an easy one for behavioral change. Do we need to print it in the first place? Have we got our printers set to double-side printing. Significant opportunity. But the one that no one, I don't know what the number was, but shipping is one. Again, we're talking about that supply chain. So even how frequently you have things shipped, what's the mode of shipment, incoming and outcoming, some decisions that can be made there that can really significantly reduce your carbon footprint. And then business travel. COVID has really taught us, a lot of businesses said, hey, we need to jump on planes and we need to jump on our cars to have those meetings to close the deal. And we had already had climate smart businesses saying, but do we? Maybe we have one architecture firm that said they went through their process of the planning process with clients and said, here's the key times we need to actually meet in person with our clients. And we're going to reduce the number of face-to-face meetings to reduce our carbon footprint. And that was way pre-COVID. Now, in the world of COVID, we recognize, we can get stuff done without business travel. So it'll be interesting to see the carbon footprints this year and how they've changed for businesses, and whether or not they continue to have those policies in place in the future, or some modification of business travel. Employee commuting can be a great engagement. It can also be totally inappropriate if you're in a low density region or your business is not located near transit. So that's very business specific. And it's usually businesses that are transit oriented location, and they really want to engage their employees that target this. So these are some of the key areas that we have businesses focus on. We also, within that, what do you do when it comes to heating, or electricity? You can change out equipment. You can also get your employees to turn it off or set it back. You can make different choices about the materials that you use for packaging or paper use. And again, transportation, so many different issues around transportation that you can be considering, from business travel to commuting to the fleet, if you have a fleet, fuel switching to, we have some businesses that just train all their delivery guys that no idling is allowed, which doesn't always go over well in cold regions of Canada, but goes over really well in warmer or in moderate regions of Canada. So again, what is relevant to your company in terms of reductions? It really depends on the sector that you're in, the region that you're in, and what's important to you. What are those co-benefits? So what about net zero? This is after all, the title of the session. So first you got to measure, and you got to manage. And then if you want to get really serious about this, we want to get to net zero. And we say net because you're never going to get to zero. I mean, frankly, breathing creates a little bit of carbon dioxide. So how does a company get to net zero, and why is this important? Well, in a nutshell, really, you want to avoid, this is the hierarchy that we talk about in greenhouse gas management. If you don't create the greenhouse gas emissions in the first place, that is the best way, to achieve GHG reductions. But of course, we got to run our businesses. So sometimes it's unavoidable. Many things are unavoidable. But we've seen during COVID, we don't always have to get on a plane or on a car to do business. So we've avoided that business travel. Or can we reduce it? So can we do things more efficiently with energy efficient lighting, or turning off our equipment at the end of the day? Or if that's not appropriate, can we replace heavy carbon emitting equipment or building systems with low carbon or no carbon systems? And we're certainly seeing in some parts of Canada, conversions around fleets to more fuel efficient or clean energy vehicles as one solution. And at the end of the day, this is avoiding, reducing, replacing. Best practices is to work on all of that, but you're not going to get to zero. So in order to get to net zero, you would then purchase offsets, carbon offsets. Now, some large companies have some other, direct investments that they're doing, but the SME sector just doesn't have that capacity. For example, there's a large chocolate company in the States that is, buying trees, buying cocoa plantations as part of their carbon sequestration to reduce or to get to net zero. That's fantastic if you have that kind of budget. But carbon offsets are typically what we would do for the SME sector. So what is a carbon offset? Also sometimes called carbon credits or emission credits. It is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that is achieved somewhere else by another business or organization that you then purchase. It's already been reduced or avoided or eliminated, and you purchase the rights to those reductions. And then it's the accounting practice. And so it's always purchased in tons. So if your footprint is, say, 50,000 tons, you've managed to get it down to that, then you would purchase that equivalent, or 5,000 or 500, depending on the size of your business, you would purchase that equivalent number of tons of carbon offsets to get to net zero. So that's what it means. So what do we mean by, reductions somewhere else? Well, maybe it's investments and development of renewable energy projects. We've seen some fantastic renewable energy projects in Alberta in the last couple of years that are helping, again, replace that dependency on coal-fired electricity in that province. So fantastic opportunity to buy carbon offsets or renewable energy credits there. Maybe it's a clean energy technology or a carbon sequestration technology that's sucking carbon out of the air or the environment, and that's a big high-tech opportunity that we're seeing. The interesting companies in the clean tech sector that are doing things around that. One that you probably are familiar with is forest conservation. Of course, there's tree planting, but trees need to get mature to really sequester carbon. But if we can preserve and protect our forests, that's called afforestation. And forests and other nature-based solutions help pull carbon or sequester it from the atmosphere. One of the areas that Radical, our parent company, has been involved in is working with farmers for years on things like no-till agriculture. Because when you actually till your agriculture, we find that we actually have greenhouse gas emissions being emitted into the atmosphere. So really just changing agricultural practices is a fantastic area of carbon offset opportunity. And it supports the agricultural sector, which is often struggling too. Again, the industrial sector, we've seen all sorts of changes in equipment that reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and changes to biofuels. So whatever kind of carbon offset resonates for your company, it might be related to your sector, or it might resonate with your client base or your employees. It's about making that purchase to support that solution and then helping your company get to net zero. A question we often get, I'm going to just preempt, is, well, hey, why don't I just reduce my GHG emissions and sell those as offsets and make some money? This is a very rigorous process, creating carbon offsets. It's actually quite expensive. It requires third-party verification and validation by engineering and accounting firms like KPMG. And it always needs to be a significant scale of project to make this worthwhile. So your typical SME probably doesn't have a project. You would not achieve enough reductions to make it worthwhile to try to create an official carbon offset. So at the end of the day, best practices, again, are you don't just go shopping for carbon offsets. Your first priority is to avoid, reduce, and eliminate as much as possible or feasible financially, technically, and logistically for your company. You measure and you reduce as much as possible, and then you get to carbon offsets. And sometimes, you make a carbon offset purchase on an annual basis, and then 5 years from now, new technology comes out, or you have the budget for another capital investment that will reduce your carbon footprint. So you need to buy fewer offsets, or maybe you don't buy them that year. So this whole world, as Alice said, about net zero, we're seeing not just countries. I think Canada is waiting for Senate to approve our commitment to net zero by 2050. We've seen now 120 countries around the world already committing to net zero. The reason why we put the date 2050 is because that's what the UN Convention on Climate said. If we don't get to net zero by 2050, our climate, we're looking at climate collapse. So that's why we're seeing that date. Although we do see some companies and some countries escalating that and saying we're going to get to net zero by 2030. And we're seeing cities, we're seeing 1,675 businesses so far have made that commitment. I don't know what that 23 is in there. And, it's been, again, the large business sector, but there's no reason why SMEs can't be part of it. And in fact, there now is a movement to engage SMEs more around being part of this race to net zero. So at the end of the day, we're seeing, we love to criticize climate action. It's almost a challenge within the environmental sector that we undermine each other when businesses or organizations are making efforts. So what is the criticism of net zero? The criticism is that, well, a few things. One is that businesses are just going to go shopping for offsets and not do serious reductions. So again, back to the best practices: reduce, eliminate, avoid, and then you get to net zero. We also see, some concern that businesses are going to just keep growing and buying offsets, and maybe some sectors are just always going to be damaging. Then there's the criticism, are the offsets quality offsets? Are they really legitimate? Well, make sure you shop, you do your research and you understand what makes a quality offset, so that you are buying things that are legitimately pulling carbon or avoiding carbon from being in the atmosphere. And then the other criticism around net zero is 2050 is way too far away. Like, is that an excuse to just business as usual? And then we'll wake up in 2049 and be in crisis. So if you are, or companies or countries or cities that are making that commitment, we need to see some milestones and interim targets in order to get there. So I think that's how you get legitimacy and answer the critics around this whole commitment to net zero. And the other thing is, what are you actually measuring? Again, best practices are you really measure what you directly and indirectly impact as a business. Don't say, you know what, I'm not going to measure that because it's going to make my footprint look bad. If you are making that impact, you need to measure it and you need to try to reduce it, and then you need to offset it if you can. So why are we doing this? Mark Carney, who's now the special envoy on climate action. He's also joined an investment company in Canada who's committing to net zero investments. He says the dialogue has shifted now from viewing climate as a risk to viewing it as an opportunity. So just like the ICC said. And he says we need to move our economies to net zero as quickly as possible. So I think I'm going to kind of leave the questions now after Mark Carney's wisdom there. So are we ready for some questions?
Thank you so much, Maureen. We sure are. There's a lot of questions that are coming in that have been coming in throughout.
Just give me the easy ones, okay? Just easy.
Okay, we'll start easy and then we'll launch into the hard ones. The first one I think is really interesting is it complicated for SMEs to measure our carbon footprint? I know you talked about kind of at the high level, but is it a hard process for a small business to undertake?
I don't think it's a hard process, particularly if you get good guidance, but I'm not going to lie to you. It takes time, it takes commitment, just like any good management practices. You can't just wing this, right? So there is a protocol, there is a standard you need to learn and you need to follow. And the reason why Climate Smart came into being is because we wanted to help SMEs with that. So Climate Smart has a tool, a software tool that you plug and play with. And this will do those calculations on things like emission factors. Whereas if you try to do that on your own, it's a lot more work. So it takes time, it takes discipline. I always say the first year is the hardest because you need to go collect that data on, what is our electricity bill? What is our gas bill? Do we track the fuel consumption of our vehicles? You probably do, but where is all that data? So the first year is always the hardest. And then we help you put systems in place and it gets smoother. But what gets measured gets managed. So it's totally worth it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think we have a couple of questions that are very similar that kind of stem the net, from that, once you've done your own measurement. It is how do businesses know what carbon offset to purchase, or how would a small business go about locating and purchasing a carbon offset and then integrating it into their own GHG measurements to get to net zero? Is there a directory, or what's that process?
Well, again, first you measure and put your plan together and work on reductions. And then every year you see what your footprint is and you say, for this year, I want to buy carbon offsets to get to net zero. Or sometimes businesses say, you know what, I can reduce in this area, but I really don't have the budget to change up my fleet this year. So I'm just going to buy carbon offsets for the, based on the fuel consumption of my fleet, for example. So, when carbon offsets first came around, 15 years ago, it was kind of a wild west and there was terrible carbon offsets on the market. I think it gave it a black eye. But the market's contracted, the better players, the legitimate players have risen to the surface. You do need to shop around, you need to ask questions. We do some workshops where we can get into more details on that. But there are things to consider with carbon offsets. And first and foremost, find a legitimate provider and ask some key questions around transparency and additionality. Additionality, would this project have been done anyway? And again, we had a whole process when I was at Van City where we would ask these questions. Who's your third-party validator? Who's your third-party verifier? So you might have these in an RFP process. But the number one thing is to find a great provider. Christine, do you want to add anything to that in terms of carbon offsets?
I think you covered it really well, Maureen. And I think you also touched upon, us joining the Radical group, which has the expertise in carbon offsets and can provide carbon offsets for our clients now in a way that we weren't able to before.
Thanks.
Okay, good to know. Another question might be a little bit more complicated. So the federal government recently announced that no ICE or light duty trucks and passenger vehicles may be sold in Canada after 2035. They also, noted all new vehicles after 2035 must be zero emission. Will carbon credits become less of a public issue in the future when you have these types of announcements coming out?
Again, carbon offsets are something we used to call them an interim tool because we wanted everyone to get to zero. But we're not going to get to zero. I don't think carbon offsets are going to go away as part of the solution. But introducing clean energy vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, if we have more affordable and accessible EVs that aren't just cars, but that are light duty trucks and larger vehicles, those will reduce your footprint. And the more that you can, reduce your footprint, the less dependent you are on carbon offsets, right? And we hope to see, government and private sector support. We had this come and go in the past, funding and rebates to help that transition of fleets, right? To make those capital investments for companies, because it can be a significant burden for companies. But one of our fantastic businesses out of the chamber in Mississauga is the Muscat. They run heavy transport trucks. They're not going to electric vehicles anytime soon. That kind of vehicle just can't. But, vehicles of future, maybe they'll run on hydrogen. But for now, what they've done is they've converted to much more fuel efficient vehicles. And I think they've reduced their fuel consumption by about 30%. So think about the financial benefit to the company and the benefit to the planet. But they're still driving transport trucks around North America because we need our goods delivered, right? So there's still a carbon footprint there.
Interesting. Another question we have here is from your perspective, working with small businesses in this space, is how has COVID impacted how small businesses are prioritizing or maybe deprioritizing GHG emission reductions, especially as so many small businesses are kind of still struggling with ongoing restrictions and with added debt from lockdowns? Like how can they prioritize this again in light of all the other kind of financial obligations that they have going on?
What a great question. Yeah, I see the gamut. I see that we've had some businesses say, listen, like we don't have the time to think about this right now. We are just struggling to keep the lights on, struggling to stay in business. And then we see the opposite. In particular, I remember a couple of event management companies, which of course their business has been gutted with COVID, but they're in my training group and they were saying, you know what, we're using this time for planning, because normally we are so busy designing, operating, and hosting events on behalf of our clients. Being able to have this luxury of taking this time to plan is fantastic. So I kind of see both ends of the spectrum. I love, there was a program last year called Build Back Better. Corporate Nights hosted a series of webinars and sessions for the business sector saying, listen, if we need to build back our economy in the post-COVID world, let's do it in a way that creates a clean economy. So we're actually seeing this intersection, and the federal government has said the same thing. They've said we need to build the economy again in Canada. Let's do it in a way that creates a clean economy. So there's a real place for this kind of shift in how you do business. But if you're just, struggling to get by, and you're in survival mode, it's hard to think about climate action, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't a question from the audience, but it just stems from what you're saying. I love that, let's take if you can't do this today, but, use this time to plan for the future. How long does that planning process take? And is it kind of a sector by sector basis or the size of your business? I mean, how far into the future, or how long does it take to kind of figure out, okay, what are we doing and how can we start reducing our emissions? How long does that planning process typically take for a business?
Well, in the Climate Smart training process, in order to be certified, you need to have a plan. And in our plan, we say we want to see 3 to 5 significant reductions that are appropriate to your business. So that's a basic plan. But we see, you know, one of the businesses, Southport, that we worked with in Winnipeg, they put together a 5-year plan and they staged it. And it's based on, you know, what, you know, our annual budget cycles. We recognize this year they have a lot of buildings. So this year we can't, you know, achieve all the capital upgrades. So let's build it into year 3. So it really depends on the size of the business and your own planning cycle. And of course, how much, you know, time and energy you put into integrating climate management into your business management. And, you know, frankly, some of the businesses were chasing them for months on end. Others get it done in, you know, a month or 2.
Okay. And on that point, there's a question here. There's some criticism of companies that are committing to net zero. Why? And I would actually take that question even further and say, is there a risk of criticism if you don't start to come up with these plans and commit to it?
I think both. And that's why I put that slide up around what is the criticism of net zero. Criticism is that some of the criticism is companies aren't really measuring their full impact. So they're claiming to get to net zero, but yet, you know, they're not really accounting for their full footprint. So you need to fully measure and take responsibility for your direct and indirect impact. So that's one of the criticisms. Another criticism is they're not doing anything to reduce, they're just buying offsets. And that's why I said best practices are you avoid, reduce, create efficiencies, then you invest in the net zero solution with offsets. And then a third criticism is, you know, are they buying quality offsets that are going to be around a while? You know, are they going to buy offsets for a forest that gets cut down a year later? Well, not if you buy quality offsets. You know, I worked on an offset project, creation of offsets in British Columbia, and that forest was protected from logging in perpetuity, so forever. So again, the quality offsets. And then the other criticism is that, you know, a lot of the net zero targets are so far in the future, 2050. What government are we going to have in place in 2050? What is my business going to be around? So, you know, if you set those net zero targets so far off in the future, is it compelling you to reductions and actions today? So make sure that you have milestones and progress and check-in along the way.
And I think those kind of milestones and progress check-ins are going to be so important because, you know, with the rollout of new technology, things like 5G, et cetera, the way that we work, you know, we've seen through COVID has changed so much. And this kind of leads perfectly into our next question is, I've lost it. It was about, here. Do you think the shift to working from home, even after COVID, will help offset business GHG emissions naturally? And are businesses going to have to kind of adapt how they measure when they don't have employees commuting every day? You're not using, you know, office supplies every day. Is that going to have a lasting impact, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. TELUS, which is a pretty large Canadian company, they already had a policy many years before COVID that they recognized that it was financially beneficial and good for the planet. It was part of their environmental strategy to have, their policy was that 100% of their employees would work from home at least some of the time. And so this was a fantastic, you know, climate solution, but frankly, think about the cost of real estate. If you can have a building that fits 1,000 people, but it actually only has square footage for 600, your costs go way, way down. So, and again, you know, when you're being strategic around climate management, how do you integrate it into other, you know, efficiencies, cost reductions, brand enhancement, new product development? That, you know, that's what they did. This was a financial efficiency when it came to real estate for them. And then COVID rolls around and people are working 100% from home. I think, you know, many businesses resisted working from home because they didn't trust their employees. They didn't think they'd be productive. And then COVID forced us to, let's see how it works. So I think we'll see some businesses, and I'm hearing this from businesses, we'll see some businesses stick to work from home, eliminate their offices or reduce the office space, or at least have some partial. So it's definitely, COVID has had a very few silver linings. And this is one of the silver linings for climate is the work from home, reduction of waste, people going to digital. You know, the banking world and the insurance world addicted to paper, right? We love our paper. And I know I was dealing with my banker with some changes in my investments during COVID. And I said, well, I guess you need me to come in and sign this, right? Because banks ought to have those original signatures. And they said, no, we can do it digitally. I almost fell off my chair because they've always said regulatory reasons. No, we need original signatures. COVID forced them into coming into the 21st century and going paper free.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there'll be some silver linings in how we manage our businesses that have climate benefits. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Another interesting question here from Jan, and this might be maybe perhaps our last one, is as I know we're kind of coming close to the end of the session. But Janet asks, how do we change the conversation to change versus finger pointing? Our business is livestock based, and our carbon sequestration, soil health improvement, water filtration are massive. I often only hear about our emissions.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm going to give you a great answer for that one. Because some of that's just human nature, right? That we just like to blame someone. But I think all businesses have an opportunity to be part of the climate solutions, to take action on climate. I think we'll see a transition in the economy, and maybe some businesses, not this one in particular, but some businesses might become, legacy businesses. If we make a full shift to a non-oil and gas based economy. That's what some people believe in. Will that happen? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But at the end of the day, every business, we work with every business. Cement sector is one of the biggest impacts on our planet. I had the thrill of working with a cement company that was so serious about their reductions. They're going to be part of that solution for climate. So I think respond to that by saying, here's what we're doing and here's the benefits of us. And again, measure it, manage it, and report it with authenticity. And I hope that makes the finger pointing going away, because finger pointing is not getting us anywhere, right? We all have to collectively come together to take this action on climate.
Well said. Listen, we're coming to the end of our session here. There's a couple of outstanding questions, and we'll pass those on to Maureen and Christine to hopefully get some answers, and we'll circulate it to the group here, as well as share a copy of the deck and presentation today to all of our attendees. On behalf of the Canadian Chamber, Christine, Maureen, thank you so much for joining us here today. It was a really, really interesting discussion, really great information. I think lots here for small businesses and medium-sized businesses to take away and kind of look at next steps. And I encourage everyone to visit Climate Smart's website and learn a little bit more about their training and certification. And we look forward to continuing to work with you here at the Canadian Chamber and delivering more services for businesses.
Well, thank you for your leadership in this, and it's been a pleasure. And thanks to everybody for taking time out of your busy days to be part of this discussion today.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.